There's a trick to learning how to read something like this in a foreign language. You have to learn how to write. Chinese is a very difficult language for most native speakers of European languages, and you probably already knew that. But it's not impossible to learn, and the best way to tell the difference between similar characters is to learn how to write them. This is actually pretty controversial, especially among Chinese learners. So I've met students of Chinese at all levels who have told me time and time again that learning how to write the language simply is not important. But the problem is what? The problem is that they're wrong. In fact, if you want to learn a language like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, even something like Vietnamese at a high level, you really need to put the time in to learn how to write. This is especially true if you're trying to read complex literature with all sorts of subtle meanings. In fact, I came across this passage in Dream of the Red Chamber just the other day. Grandma Jia wanted to have Jia Baoyu and Lin Dayu stay in rooms near her in order to jiemen. Jiemen can mean to entertain herself, but it can also mean to overcome sorrow. It's also not a word that you're likely to hear in spoken conversation. But it's important to know if you're reading literature, and it's also an important thing to know if you want to speak the language at a high level. So the truth is that there are just certain words that you won't learn in Chinese or Japanese or German or Danish or even English if you only stick with the colloquial spoken language. You don't necessarily need to know how to speak like a professor, but if you really want to understand the language, you have to understand different language registers. Well, fortunately, jiemen is not a particularly difficult word to learn. However, in my experience, the absolute best way to learn a word like this is to practice writing it down. And so, when I study Anki every morning, I make sure that there are cards in the mix that test my writing abilities. This includes both writing by hand and typing. And both are important, especially for languages that use Chinese characters or other unusual writing systems. So we're going to start off here by talking about writing by hand and some of the rules that I've created for myself over the years. Let's start off with the handwriting part first. Over 15 years ago, I made a scan of a page from a Chinese writing book for children. I've printed this page out thousands of times and used these boxes to practice writing Chinese characters. Now, setting this up in Anki is actually pretty easy. So let's take a look at my Anki decks. As you can see, I have a bunch of note types. This is what Chinese looks like. Under Chinese, I've got multiple card types, which you can see here. What we're interested in is handwriting. Now, the particular card type that we see here is for writing in traditional Chinese. Note here that I'm using a conditional. If there's something in the simplified field of my Chinese card, it will specify that this card is for the traditional form of the character. By the way, this is what the Chinese note template that I use looks like, and you can see the simplified field right here. Now, the way that this card works is simple. It shows the pronunciation and definition on the front side and also plays the audio. On the back, it shows everything from the front side plus the written form of the character. I also like to make the character larger than normal so I can see it clearly. The way I go through this is actually simple. If I come across one of those handwritten cards at random through Anki, I stop. I write the character or word down once on the writing paper, and if I write it correctly, I finish writing 2 lines worth of that character, I mark it as good in the system and move on. If I'm wrong, I still write 2 lines worth, I mark it as bad, and I end up writing it again before my study session that day is through. It's that simple, and that's how you learn. And this is the card for simplified handwriting. As you can see, the entire card is sandwiched in a conditional. And if there is no different simplified form in the database, Anki will tell me in the preview that the front of the card is blank. Now that's because Anki will not make a card if the entire card type is sandwiched by that conditional and the note does not meet the conditional. Or in other words, if it's looking for something in the simplified field and there's nothing there, it just won't make that card. Now that's really cool when you understand that, because it means that you don't have to worry about editing out words that don't have different Chinese simplified characters that are different from the traditional ones. Those are filtered out automatically without you having to do anything extra as long as you set it up right. Anyway, we can do the same thing for Japanese. Now, for Japanese, the Japanese field is actually for hiragana or katakana, depending of course on the word. I've got a different field for the kanji down here. So, for most handwriting, I'll show myself the definition and the kanji if there are kanji for the word. And on the back side, I'll see the hiragana. That's what I'm testing myself on. And naturally, I've made a card for the kanji that does the opposite. Note again that I've surrounded this card with that conditional sandwich. The idea here is to practice the kanji, sure. However, I also want to make sure that I know the hiragana and the katakana well, and the best way to learn those is also to practice writing them. I even do the same thing with Korean. If you've learned Korean, you know that Hangul is actually really easy. However, there are some finicky things that come with the spelling of certain words. Anyway, the idea here is the same. I've also included Hanja, or the Chinese characters, when necessary. And I've got a separate card type for learning how to write the Hanja by hand. Once again, you can see that I've used that conditional. Learning to write by hand takes time. It took time for us when we were in elementary school, right? It took time to sit down and practice writing A, B, C, D, and I did a bad job at it. That's why my handwriting's so bad. But it's worth it to put in the time and effort. The fastest way for you to get a personal feel for Chinese characters or for the kanji or whatever is to write them by hand. That makes them a part of you. So my handwriting is awful, but I still do this anyway. In fact, I think that this is a key component of any foreign language learning. But there is one more trick up my sleeve that you probably don't know how to do yet.
That's good.
There's a way you can have Anki test you on your typing ability.
La télévision.
This can be useful for languages for which writing by hand doesn't make a lot of sense. And in the case of East Asian languages, this can also help you a lot with character recognition.
歓楽街
ために
Now, I'll show you how to do this in German, though the same steps will work with just about any language. As you can see here, my German notes have a card type called dictation. I ask myself to write this language grammar. I then play the sound. And then I have the field name with the word type and a colon in front of it. What this does is it creates a field that will pop up and ask you to fill it in. And the cool thing is that Anki will check for you to see if you got it right or not. I always show myself the definition, of course, just in case I've got two words that sound the same but are spelled differently. Now, when we look at the back, you can see from the example how Anki will tell you if you were right or wrong. Letters that are incorrect in what you typed will show up in red. Letters that were right will show up in green. And in the original, it will mark in gray the letters that you wrote wrong. Now, the cool thing about this is that this can help you learn how to type in languages that have different and difficult keyboard layouts. For example, the Korean keyboard layout isn't that easy to memorize. However, if you practice typing words in Korean, you'll figure it out. It's really not hard. Chinese is relatively simple with pinyin. However, with Chinese, you do need to select the correct character from the pop-up, which sometimes can be challenging. The same is true with Japanese. And then you have languages like Vietnamese where the diacritics are really important if you want to tell words apart. The easiest way to learn is to practice writing. You also sometimes get really frustrating languages like Danish where the pronunciation is nothing like what I would expect the word to sound like. Once again, the best way to learn is to practice writing. Anyway, there you have it. Anki is really cool. So do you want to win the spelling bee? Well, Anki can help you, but really only if you know tricks like this. And remember, learning how to write is a fundamental and vital part of learning how to read and how to speak.